The sacred practice of naming our shit. So I'd stand up in front of our community many, many times and tell stories that preachers don't tell. Stories about my failures, stories about my shortcomings. I wanted to see what would happen. Now, I suspected that folks would still love me. I wasn't sure, but they did. And that, over time, morphed into our sacred practice of naming our shit. And that became the foundation of authentic belonging. Now, we all yearn for places to be our realest selves, to be fully known, the shiny parts as well as the ugly parts. So, how do we build communities like that? Now, it can be done. I know. I actually did it. And let's talk a little bit more today about how. Now, the last episode, I talked about naming out loud the core underlying doctrines of late-stage capitalism, also naming a different set of doctrines, underlying doctrines, and that, I said, was a good first step. But today, let's talk about the structures and the systems that we build on top of those different doctrines, infrastructure to help us live our way into new ways of thinking. Now, for us, our practical infrastructure began with storytelling, which I know doesn't sound practical yet, but it really is, because stories change us, and stories change everything. So we organized practical systems for storytelling. Stories shape our identity, shape who we believe ourselves to be. Stories change our instincts, change our behaviors, change our communities. So, our first practical system was, very simply, a calendar reminder for me. It reminded me once a month to out loud, in public, tell stories that preachers don't tell. Stories about my own sin, about my own shortcomings, all the while wondering if I could do that and still belong. I tried to be as transparent as I could within the limits of what was helpful. I would talk about my personality and my Enneagram type. I would talk about my family history and how these things would trip me up and hurt the people that I love, hurt me, hurt my life. And after I made whatever point the story was trying to make, I would also say something like, hey, don't look at me like that. I know you people, you do stuff like that too. And I would say something like, and you know, you still love me, you do, which turned out to be true. Nobody ever stopped loving me. Nobody used my disclosures against me. In fact, quite the contrary. You can hear that part of the story. I did something about that during the Socrates series, I think. The episode is called Talking About Our Shit and Still Belonging After We Do. But the reason I'm telling you it today is, over time, my stories begin to evoke other people's stories. Others begin to talk about their shadow sides. And it became safe. And it became unremarkable for people to name their shit. What started as a calendar reminder became over time transparency in a community. People telling their shadow stories and being accepted. The practice of storytelling became the practice of belonging. Storytelling is an important structure to help us resist the toxic doctrines of late-stage capitalism and to build communities of non-compliance. We build belonging with stories. Creating a new assumption that you and I belong on this earth, in these bodies, in this community, that is the function of storytelling. So I told stories, then we told stories, and then we began to belong. Here's another structure we used. It's another storytelling structure. We started a special kind of groups, prioritized them, worked to get broad participation in them. We called them life story groups. Now on my website, doughammock.com, you can read about them in the quick guide section. Very simple format, 3 to 4 people meet 3 to 4 times. And each time, one person tells the story of their life. We form them twice a year, and we say as we do, you can sanitize your story as much as you want to, but we have found that it's a lot more fun when we tell our stories as straight up as we can, as honest as we are able. Well, these groups helped us become a community of belonging. Now, I did them even before I got to Common Thread, and I kept doing them because of one experience that I had early on in the process, right after I got here. So there I am, I'm telling my story, and I see something as I am telling it that I had not seen until that moment. That happens. Telling our stories later, we are not the same person we were when we were living those stories. So we will often get new perspective or self-understanding. Mine was an ugly story. I was a teenager. My mother told me with great emotional affect that she wanted to end her life. And I'm 14 years old. And not surprisingly, that experience evoked an explosive reaction inside of me, a surge of emotion I could barely contain. I had to get out of the room. I went into my own room. I closed the door. And behind the door was a tennis racket. I picked it up and I began to beat on the bed just to off-gas some of that explosive reaction inside of me physically until I was spent, exhausted into a pile. So I'm telling this story. And I'm watching my 14-year-old self live that story, and I realize in that moment how non-emotional I had been since that experience. Maybe it was because I'd felt that emotions were dangerous or that I was going to be out of control. I never consciously shut down emotion, but it had happened. And telling my story, I saw that it had happened, which initiated several years of restoring emotional capacity, reaccessing those parts of me that I had unconsciously suppressed. So again, storytelling, a great way to live into new thinking. That's great. But that's not why I'm telling you the story. I'm telling you the story because there were 3 other people in that group with me. And those 3 became an inextricable part of my life. I had lunch with one of them just last week, 30 years later. Those people became where I live my way into new thinking. They became where I belong, where I am seen and I am known, where I talk about my shit and still belong after I do. I think differently because I have lived in those relationships. I reawakened emotionally because I have lived in those relationships, in that kind of community. I have not needed to pretend. I have been able to live transparently, and I have belonged when I have. I am more compassionate because I have lived in compassionate relationships. I am less judgmental because I have lived in non-judgmental relationships. I am more trusting and trustworthy because I have lived with trusting and trustworthy people. My soul, my mind, my being have healed living in this environment. So, that's a very practical structure. Life story groups. Now again, look them up in the quick guide section. How we became able to live our way into new ways of thinking. How we became a community of non-compliance, a community of deep belonging. I told my story. We told our stories. We did groups where we all told our stories to one another. We didn't only do life story groups. We created dozens of kinds of groups to experiment, to trial and error our way forward. How do we live our way into new thinking? That same quick guide section, those are the ones that took over the years. You can look them over. Now, we prioritized these groups. We didn't have a big budget for most of our years, and we found that groups that happened after the weekly gathering on Sundays, for those 90 minutes afterwards, people were already dressed, people had already driven, we would get better participation. So it was a sacrifice for us to pay for childcare for those 90 minutes, but we did everything we could to get broad participation because it was a structure, a practical way to change our thinking, a practical way to become a non-compliant community of belonging. Now, I don't want to oversell storytelling or groups or authentic sharing. These are steps. They are just steps. But over time, string enough of those steps together and something beautiful does emerge. We mitigate. We come out from underneath. We stop complying with those toxins of late-stage capitalism that have been force-fed us for so long. We combat those gazillions of dollars and all that behavioral science hacking of our brains. So yeah, they're just steps, but they're good steps. They're important steps. And over the years, especially as we accumulated some shared experience along the way, every once in a while, but often enough that I would notice, something would happen in our community, some radical expression of belonging, some dramatic example of anti-late-stage capitalism living, and I would be floored. Once in a while, but not rarely. Because again, string enough of those small steps together, something beautiful emerges. Okay, in the next episode, we're going to talk about another way to resist the toxicity of late stage capitalism, and it is going to be to build communities of rest, because rest is also non-compliance, living in this culture as we do. So if you'd like to get notified when that goes live, you know what to do. Go ahead and subscribe.